Hi, I'm Kelly and I draw things, and this is the behind the scenes of my art process from start to finish. This is a very common creative process that's taught in a lot of art schools, and you'll see it throughout many different industries. It might have different names for each step, but the overall idea is the same. Essentially, it's working from broad ideas to small details. And so I'm going to walk you through this process and how I used it to make this drawing of a bedroom. So the first step I take is brainstorming. Brainstorming is generating a lot of ideas for one prompt or project. I recommend using words to brainstorm instead of drawing, because you're always going to be able to write faster than you can draw. And when I was told this by my professor, I was kind of offended. I was like, I draw really fast. I don't know what you're talking about. And he was like, okay, ready? Establishing shot. And I was like, okay, I can see your point. So I do recommend using words so your hand can keep up with your brain. Or at least try to. While brainstorming, don't be editing, don't be throwing any ideas out. The good, the bad, the ugly, put them all down on the paper. Editing will come later. Because sometimes a bad idea can lead to a good idea, and you wouldn't have gotten to that good idea if you hadn't written the bad idea down in the first place. So don't take a chance, just put it all out there. For me, I like using mind maps. It's where I start with the main idea in the middle and branch out to smaller ideas and then even smaller ideas, and it creates kind of this spider web of all these ideas around this one concept. I do this until I fill my page or I get tired of doing it, whatever comes first. And then I'll review my brainstorm and I'll combine bits and pieces. Sometimes I take two ideas from opposite sides of the mind map and put them together, and even if they're kind of both ordinary ideas, together they're really unique, so that's always fun. Or for this drawing, all of my mind maps were different details that could be included in different sections of the room, so I used a lot more ideas to inspire the final piece than maybe just picking one or two. Just kind of depends on how the project works out. So for this brainstorm specifically, I started with lo-fi room in the middle. I knew I wanted to create a drawing of an isometric lo-fi room. Isometric is a type of viewpoint in perspective. And I knew that's what I wanted to draw, so that's what I put in the middle. Then I broke down basics of what I wanted in the room. For example, I wanted a fluffy rug. For me, that felt cozy and nice and squishy, and it's something I wanted to include. And then I added details about the rug. I wanted it small and I wanted it round. That made it fluffier and cuter for some reason in my head. And so then I took those details and put them into the final drawing. But I did this for each part of the room, and it gave me a lot of different details to consider when bringing them all together. That way I wasn't repeating things throughout, and there was a lot of visual interest and a lot of different elements throughout the composition. I didn't use all the ideas. Some of them were bad, but I'm glad I wrote down the bad ideas because some of them led to better ideas that I did end up including. So after brainstorming, it is time to do some more research. You may have done some already before you started the project, but I like to brainstorm and then have a really solid list of what I need to research and learn more about to get started on visually developing the project. So for me, this means gathering reference images. Highly recommend everyone uses reference images for any project. If you want to know why, you can go check out that video. I talked about it on my channel. But I like to use Pinterest. Pinterest is a website where you can organize images, thoughts, and ideas into boards. Think of bulletin boards, but digitally. And the nice thing about Pinterest is it'll provide you other things that it think might fit with your board that you may not have otherwise seen. So I think it's a good way to get new and different reference than maybe you're used to seeing. And that's just going to grow your creative content and what you know how to work with. Depending on the topic, you can also do a lot more research. If you're drawing a 1920s building, you might need to research the architecture of what goes into a 1920s building. For me, this lo-fi room was really from my imagination, and it was things that I just found comfy and nice, so I didn't have to do a ton of external research on this. The next step for me is creating thumbnails. Thumbnails are small, loose drawings where you're trying out a ton of different ideas and compositions in a broad sense. You're not focusing on the details yet. The reason it's called a thumbnail is because it's supposed to be small, like your thumbnail. My thumbnails aren't actually as small as my actual thumbnail because I have small hands, but they're usually an inch to a couple inches tall. Even when I'm working on a digital canvas, I try not to zoom in a ton. I try to stay zoomed out and draw small because it's really easy to try to zoom in digitally and create something big, and you zoom out and you spend a ton of time on something you might not even use. If you're having trouble with this, I recommend using a bigger brush digitally, and that'll force you to not worry about details because you can't get them in there anyway. So these are my thumbnails. I only did a few. Sometimes I do dozens of thumbnails, sometimes I do 3 or 4. It depends on the project. And for my thumbnails, I use them to test out room layouts and see what worked best. So I moved the furniture around, rotated the bed, added some stuff, took away some stuff, and just tried to get a general idea that I liked. And then for this project, I picked my top one. Sometimes if I'm having a lot of trouble deciding, I'll pick 2 or 3 and develop all 3 of them further, and then I'll have 3 really clear ideas I can see side by side and compare. Once I chose my thumbnail, I just made it big on the page, and then I got to move on to my next step, which is making a tight rough. A tight rough is just what it sounds like. It is a tighter drawing, but still very rough. It's kind of an oxymoron. I'm working in Clip Studio Paint, so I always put the drawing below in this light blue color, so I can use a darker color like black to draw over it and not confuse my drawings. This helps me distinguish my drawing from the previous step I was working on. So like I said, I just take my thumbnail, I make it the size of the canvas I'm working on, and then I start adding in all of my details. I am drawing with perspective in mind, but I'm not on a perspective grid yet. That'll come later. And then I work big to small. I kind of jump around adding big chunks of the drawing and then going back in and layering details on top of them. So for example, I lay out the bookshelf, I flesh out what the bookshelf is gonna look like, and then I put all the stuff on the bookshelf. And then I put the designs and patterns on the books on the bookshelf. So I'm not working in full detail down like a printer would. I'm definitely scaling down into the details as I draw the different sections of the image. This helps me lay things out so they're believable in face before spending all my time on these details that I would then have to erase if they weren't in the exact right position. After my details are all worked out in my tight rough, it's time to pencil my piece. To pencil is kind of like being used as a verb here. It's kind of a weird phrase, but essentially it's taking your tight rough drawing and turning it into a really tight pencil drawing where all the perspective is right, all the details are there, any text you might have is laid out, everything is really solid. First, I fix my perspective. I'll do this by drawing basic measuring guides over my tight rough on a new layer. In my tight rough, I've turned blue, so again, I can differentiate the perspective lines from the tight rough drawing. So this can get really confusing and a lot of lines can be going on, especially if it's a really complicated perspective piece. So sometimes if there's just too many, I can't tell what's going on, I'll bring in a red pen as well, and I will use the black to measure and then the red to get the actual perspective lines. And then I'll be working in 3 layers of color, and that just helps me understand what's going on, because if I have just a big spider web of black lines, it can get really confusing. This drawing wasn't that complicated, but some of my comic pages get that way. Then I use the perspective lines as a guide to then draw over again all the details, but this time they're in perspective and they're solid. The more thinking I do now, the better it'll look in the end. So I want every detail possible worked out. Ideally, I would be able to hand this off to someone else and they would be able to finish the drawing without having to ask me any questions. So all the facial expressions are there, all the folds in the fabric, all the titles on the books, everything is on the page. After I'm done with my pencil drawing, it's then time to ink it. Inking is tracing your pencil drawing with an ink pen to make line work. Now, tracing is a tricky term. It's a bit more than just blindly tracing. You are still considering things like line width and weight, which means how thick the line is, because you're going to want to use those aspects to create different effects in your drawing. For example, sometimes I will take the line weight and make it thicker at the bottom of the object, and this will cause the eye to visually weight the object onto the surface it's sitting on in a really simple way. But it's also really effective and can add a lot to the piece. I didn't do that a ton in this drawing. Maybe I should have, but this is something I do, especially when I'm designing stickers or a really close-up detailed shot. It can really round out the image. I personally also add a lot of texture into my drawings at the inking stage. This could be wood grain, dots and texture on the walls, things like that. After I'm done inking, it's time to color it, and coloring can be broken down to a few different steps as well. For me, I have 3 different subcategories within my coloring step. The first one is color comps. Color comps is short for color compositions, and it's making more thumbnails, but just with color and testing out different color palettes. So what I do is I copy my ink drawing that I've done, just the ink, not everything else below it, and then I paste it onto a new document or a new canvas, and I make it small. Once it's small, I can copy and paste it multiple times on the canvas to have multiple drawings to test color palettes on. And then I loosely blob in my colors. I use a pretty big brush to again avoid getting super detailed, and I don't stay within the lines at all. I believe this step is a lot more important than it looks. Occasionally I'll be like, I'm a professional artist, I don't need to do this step, and I try to go in and just color straight on the big drawing, and I get so frustrated, it takes forever, and then I end up coming back and doing this step anyway, and I would have saved time, effort, and frustration if I just done it at the beginning. So for these color comps, it took me 3 tries to get to a place I like. Sometimes it takes me 10 to 20. Like sometimes I'm super indecisive and want to try a lot of different things. For this one, I had a pretty good idea in mind, so I just tested out pinks, blues, and yellows all together, and I kind of stayed in that range. But you can be as broad or as limited in testing color palettes as you want. And then I take this and I use it as a guide for my main drawing. After I have my guide, I'm ready to put in the flats. Flats, or flatting your image, is putting in the base colors all on one layer underneath your line art. They're called flats because dimensionally they are flat. There's no shading yet. It's just the base color. This is another step where we're working in broad areas first and then working down to details as we go. Now, flatting for commercial projects and flatting for personal projects is a different process, especially for comics. You need to have your ink on one layer and then all of your color on a layer under it with 0 blank spots and gaps, where if you take the line work away, all the colors touch. I use a tool in Clip Studio to do this really quickly, and I don't do each color by hand. For my own illustrations I print on my studio printer, which is right there, I just use the paint bucket tool to fill in between the line art. It saves me a lot of time because it doesn't need to be correctly flatted because it's not going to an industrial printer. So freelance work is going to be done different than personal work. Use your best judgment for your project. After I get all the flats down, I get to start shading. I start with the shadows first. I do my shadows on a multiply layer. This is a layer style that you can set to your layer in a digital program. It mixes the colors you have on the multiply layer with the color underneath it, making it darker. Think of when you put on sunglasses and everything looks a little darker. That's kind of like what the multiply layer does. Each flat color has a different color above it on the multiply layer to give the shadows more color depth. And then I have this layer somewhere between 50 and 70%, depending on how strong I want the lighting. After I do all my shadows, the highlights are next. I put my highlights on an overlay layer, which is another layer style like multiply, but it makes things lighter instead. The overlay layer is kind of like when you have a flashlight and you shine it on something and it makes everything a lot lighter and brighter. Same way. And I put that about 70%, maybe 50% if it's softer lighting. And then I save my special effects for last. The type of effects layers I will use will greatly depend on the drawing. Sometimes I don't use them at all, sometimes I use a ton of them. This time I used a ton of them because I wanted that glowy, mystical feel. So for this one, I used a soft light layer. It's a lot like overlay, but softer. And for me, I used it to unify the image with one color over the whole thing. Then I turned that into a bunch of different gradients on different layers and just played with them until I was happy with it. It's a lot of trial and error for special effects for me. And then I actually added the background at the end. Normally I don't add the background afterwards. I work on it at the same time, at the same rate as the rest of the drawing. But this drawing has an isolated subject in the middle, and I wanted the background to show through those windows, so I saved it until last. You can see I did thumbnail it on the color comp, so I knew what was going to be back there. But I still tried out a couple other options because I started to doubt myself, and then I realized what I tried out on the color comp was the best, so I ended up going back to it. Now, if this was a comic book or a book cover or something, the next step would be lettering. It's not, so I didn't add any lettering on this, but I did sign and add a watermark to my artwork. Watermarks can be big or small. For me, they're small, and it's just my website and my social media handle. I heavily recommend everyone put some sort of watermark on their work if they're posting it on social media. This is mostly because things will get copied, pasted, reposted, saved. Someone really likes it, they send it to their friend. And if you have where people can find more of your work on the actual image, they're more likely to find their way back to you to buy your work, follow you, things like that. Or it can lead to people hiring you, which is always good. Then after the lettering is done, occasionally I will add a correction layer and tweak the colors or the lightness or the darkness, depending on the project. And that's the behind the scenes of my art process from start to finish. If you like this video, you might also like this video, where I share the worst art advice I've ever received and what I wish I would have been told instead. Thank you for watching. Bye.